Chapter 25. Design in Mind. Scientists are slowly waking up to an inconvenient truth. The universe looks suspiciously like a fix. Paul Davies. Anything that physicists deem contrary to materialism becomes a problem. For example, the mental nature of reality showcased by quantum mechanics is the measurement problem. So it is with the finely tuned universe. Instead of accepting the obvious implication, they refer to it as the fine-tuning problem. One may be charitable and say that the problem is not that it conflicts with their dogma, but that it avoids assuming a conclusion. Perhaps some objective people merely want objective evidence. Unfortunately, you won't find many of those among modern physicists. It only seems to be fine-tuned, is axiomatic, and implies a foregone conclusion. Unsurprisingly, you will never hear them say, "Physicists now have evidence that the universe is designed. Maybe we should take another look at the God hypothesis." They religiously devote themselves to their materialism as Christians dedicate themselves to Christ. The only difference is that Christians admit it. They commonly have a colloquial term for anything that smacks of anything immaterial: woo-woo. One YouTube science educator even has a comical woo-woo alarm to alert his audience of unapproved scientific ideas he may have to broach. At the very least, such language and behavior show that they are on their guard for anything that may infringe upon the holy tenets of physicalism, ready to battle against it, even before a fair hearing. Science prophets have conveniently sequestered materialism into their monastery and have built arbitrary walls between it and philosophy. That is getting into philosophy, they will say, to dismiss any distasteful subject quickly. But the distinction between philosophy and science is arbitrary. For example, they might say science is about making observations and experiments, but philosophy is about reason and logic. This definition is absurd on its face, since science cannot be devoid of reason and logic, and philosophy does not ignore experience. Another difference made is similarly asinine. Science is objective, but philosophy is more general, subjective, and abstract. This definition is an insult to philosophy and, itself, an overgeneralization. Quantum mechanics has smashed this notion of objectivity anyway, as I hope the reader already inferred. So it is derisory how agnostic physicists demand a wall of separation between philosophy and science, yet continually pontificate how their science proves some aspect of their metaphysical dogma. Religious apologists, for them, are disdained except for the infrequent easy target presented for debates. The stronghold of scientific dogma grounded in so-called consensus undermines the very openness needed for discovery in the first place. As Michael Crichton supposedly said, the greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with the consensus. The consensus is so tribal that any scientist who commits to any heretical hypothesis is immediately, and with malice, made an anathema and a pariah. Science, in short, has become scientism. Dr. Steve Taylor, the author of Spiritual Science, 2018, accused most scientists, including physicists and psychologists especially, of slavery to what Thomas Kuhn, 1962, called a paradigm. He wrote in a blog post for Psychology, "Today, the following. Belief systems form a distorting filter through which their adherents view the world. This is usually surreptitious, in the sense that adherents don't usually even realize that they have adopted a belief system. They interpret the world through the prism of their beliefs without being consciously aware of any filtering or distorting. A paradigm, says Kuhn, is a way of viewing something. It is a mental model. Scientists will labor under their mental models, especially if they have much emotional, intellectual, and cultural investment in the idea, until cognitive dissonance swallows them beneath the waves of doubt. Then, some courageous souls will embrace the paradigm, opening the door to a newfound openness to, and even adoption of, the new paradigm by even more colleagues. This revolution in thinking, Kuhn called a paradigm shift. Because of the dogmatism of scientists, science does not evolve over a slow but steady, gradual process. It goes in fits and starts. It certainly does not help advance knowledge when physicists, blinded by their brilliance, are taken by paradigm paralysis rather than a paradigm shift. We have already demonstrated the mental nature of reality. Still, it is baffling why scientists stubbornly hold their metaphysical ground and never consider alternative meta-narratives. Their metaphysical chauvinism belittles their values of objectivity and curiosity. For example, physicists will admit that the universe seems finely tuned for life. Even physicists extremely antagonistic to theism admit what the evidence implies. They just will not accept the implication. If the set values in the gravitational force constant, electromagnetic force constant, strong nuclear force constant, weak nuclear force constant, and especially the cosmological constant, were slightly different, life as we understand it would not exist. Since these are constants, meaning they lack apparent necessity for their values, they show up in the math. And since their fine-tuning is measured relative to the others, physicists know that all of them tuned within the appropriate ranges suitable for life is highly unlikely. In desperate attempts to protect their paradigm, they concoct faith assumptions like the multiverse, megaverse, convoluted attempts to demonstrate necessity that go nowhere, assume that life could arise in other ways, or argue the famous, question-begging weak anthropic principle. The weak anthropic principle is not a scientific argument, but can be outlined as follows. No one should be surprised that we live in the universe with the Goldilocks set of values, because if it did not, we would not be here to observe the values in the first place. The word surprised is shorthand for whatever the improbability, we won the lottery. In other words, it does not matter what the probabilities are, since we apparently got lucky and live in the seemingly fine-tuned universe. The argument is blatantly question-begging because it assumes what it tries to prove with a sneaky reassertion of chance. Here is a summary of the idea. The fine-tuning is unlikely, but we know this because we were lucky. Physicists are codependent in their relationship with chance. The other typical example of this love affair is the multiverse hypothesis. This hypothesis arises from the previously mentioned property in quantum mechanics called superposition. They argue that a new timeline occurs when the wave function collapses, allowing the veneration of the goddess of chance once more. However, the thesis has no evidence and complicates reality by positing infinite universes in complete disregard for the observation of this timeline. Secondly, such universes are not measurable and accordingly not physical, if they exist at all. Therefore, such physicists ironically posit our world is one of many immeasurable spiritual worlds. I doubt that was their intention. Some, however, argue that many other universes exist and have their own properties alongside our universe. However, no evidence supports this version of the multiverse theory, which is also unfalsifiable. Pushing biased speculation aside, this multiverse version would require some standard connection between all the individual universes. Otherwise, the improbabilities would remain like the odds for a jackpot in each slot machine in the multi-casinos in Las Vegas. There would need to be a generator of universes that vary the laws of nature for each one created. This necessity renders the argument against fine-tuning moot by simply taking it back a step, undermining the whole point. What about cheating on chance with physical necessity? It turns out that arguments for necessity are even more dubious. For instance, the late physicist Stephen Hawking suggested a somewhat perplexing solution to the fine-tuning problem. Hawking employed intricate mental gymnastics to avoid invoking divine explanations, leading him to a peculiar necessity argument for creation. He referred to this inclination as quantum cosmology, positing that the laws of physics in isolation can account for the universe's existence from nothingness. According to this viewpoint, it is believed that descriptions of the universe itself, acknowledged by materialists as physical laws, served as the catalyst for its creation. This notion of creation ex nihilo may be embraced by idealists who believe that thoughts can conceive something out of nothingness. However, it presented a contradictory stance for someone like Stephen Hawking, who strongly opposed theological explanations. Yet paradoxically enough, this was precisely his argument. Physicist Lawrence Krauss echoes the utter silliness of this argument. For surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. Such is this hypothesis's primary and most deafening problem. It defies logic. Any rational person admits that a cake cannot bake itself. Yet, his proposal plainly violates the law of causation, which leads to a self-contradictory implication. The laws of nature created the universe by breaking the law of causation. See the utter incoherence to the argument. Hawking would have been more honest if he had simply said, "The universe just is. Now shut up." The second problem is that it does not explain why the universal constants are what they are. Hawking's specific cosmological theory argues that the universe began with no singularity. So, instead of the standard cosmology, he tweaked the math to round the universe's beginning in hopes of blunting the standard cosmology's theological implications and finding a quantum explanation for the universe. Talk about origins is like asking what lies south of the South Pole, he said. This proves how inept physicists are when they leave physics for metaphysics. Yet, even with his tweaking of the math, he gives no empirical or mathematical necessity that the values of the constants could not be otherwise. Third is that universes arising from vacuum energy must be highly improbable, otherwise we would frequently see big bangs arising from the quantum vacuum or the laws of physics. Therefore, Hawking still failed to address the improbability of the fine-tuning problem. Again, what is the point of theorizing around fine-tuning if your theory supports the idea? Fourth, Hawking is engaging in magical thinking since he is ascribing powers to mental-like natural laws where such powers are inconsistent with the materialism he purports to promote. Remember that under physicalism, mental states like information and mathematics only describe how the universe works. It cannot intrinsically imagine anything into being. The cookbook in my kitchen has never once baked me a breakfast quiche. John Lennox was correct. Nonsense remains nonsense, even when talked by world-famous scientists. The most parsimonious rationale, as I have argued, is that reality is the product of imagination and is mental in nature. Fine-tuning is merely an example of that mind's consistent and coherent nature. Put another way, the laws of nature are simply the grammar for reading God's story. The path of science is leading people away from materialism, but in response, physicists gaslight rather than listen. They argue that the book writes itself. I say the author writes it. Is not the latter more rational? Another YouTube science educator, Arvin Ash, once told me, "I am perfectly willing to accept intelligent design if there was evidence for it." Instead, he should say that he would entertain intelligent design if there were more evidence. At least that would be more intellectually honest.